All right, welcome everyone to our webinar on trash to action, using trash data to take informed action for your waterways. My name is Colleen Walters. I'm the Delaware River Basin Program Manager for River Network. For those of you who are unfamiliar, River Network is a national organization. We work to strengthen and empower local groups working for clean water and healthy rivers. We focus on 4 key areas, those being clean, safe, affordable drinking water, clean water laws and policies, resilient cities and communities, and healthy rivers and agricultural landscapes. We offer lots of resources and toolkits and peer learning opportunities. We have an online community where water practitioners across the country can connect with one another. So if you haven't already and you're interested, please go to rivernetwork.org. We also have membership opportunities available, free and paid memberships. And so you can find more information on our website. So I want to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panel of presenters today. And while I'm doing that, we'd love for you to share your name and your organization, your pronouns, where you're calling in from in the chat today, so we can say hello to one another and welcome one another into this space. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panel of presenters that we have with us today, starting off with Ellen Kohler. Ellen is the Director of Applied Research Programs at the Water Centers at University of Pennsylvania. She has more than 25 years of experience addressing the legal, regulatory, and policy context of water quality and natural resource challenges. She's worked with River Network for many years, helping to educate and empower local organizations in the Delaware River Basin on Clean Water Act policy and tools. We also have Carla Noboa. Carla is the Community Engagement Manager for River Network. Through working with corporate funders and community partners, they help organize litter management projects across the United States that have removed millions of pounds of trash over the last decade. Next, we have Christian Murphy, who is the Ecology Coordinator for the Bronx River Alliance. He manages the collection and processing of water quality data and organizes students and volunteers who participate in stewardship along the Bronx River. Christian earned a Bachelor of Science from SUNY Hunter College in Environmental Studies and Earth Science, and spent a season in Western Colorado performing ecological research on rare and endangered species for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. Next, we have Rosanna De Silva. She is the Water Quality Program Manager at the Hudson River Foundation and New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program, where she works with partner organizations and agencies to manage water resources and improve water quality in the harbor estuary. She dedicates her time toward incorporating science, data collection, and community engagement into addressing water quality challenges and uses an educational lens to communicate science. Rosanna has a master's in education and science education and a BS in environmental sciences from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. And lastly, we have Martha Narvaez, the Associate Director of the University of Delaware Water Resources Center, a unit in the Institute for Public Administration in the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration. Martha has worked at the Water Resource Center for 18 years on projects to increase public knowledge about water resources and provide science and technical data to decision makers in Delaware and the region. She is a graduate of Lehigh University with a BS in biology and University of Delaware with a master's in public administration. So those are our wonderful presenters, and I'm going to kick it off by passing it along to Ellen, who's going to give us a nice overview of the Clean Water Act and how it relates to trash data and trash monitoring. And then we'll kick it off to our presenters to talk about their projects. And just feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and we will save some time at the very end to address those questions. So thank you all, welcome, and I will pass it along to Ellen.
Thanks so much, Colleen, and thank you all very much for joining us today. I'll just give you a quick introduction to the Water Center if you're not familiar with the Water Center. It's been at Penn for about 3 years. We are an applied research center focused on water resource management and water infrastructure systems, both locally, well, not both, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. as Colleen mentioned, I'm going to just provide a quick grounding in the Clean Water Act and how trash is addressed. And just in case you're not as familiar with the words of the Clean Water Act, we'll just do this pretty quickly. The goal of the act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our waters. So trash touches on that physical element. Goal was to eliminate all our discharges by 1985, set water quality standards that are at least a minimum across all the states, but states can then adopt standards that are a bit more, that can be more stringent if they so choose. So water quality standards are set at the state level, but the EPA sets that minimum. Next slide. And then those standards get incorporated into permits, and the goal of the permits are really to ensure that any discharges that do get into the waters are still protective of public health, public water supplies, agricultural and industrial uses, and protecting and the protection and propagation of shellfish, fish, wildlife, and recreational activities. So this is the sort of the language in the act where we get sort of that fishable, swimmable idea, or fishable and all waters should be available for fishing and recreational uses. But the discharge permit piece, like that, so that's how we're supposed to be managing those discharge permits. And those permits include the municipal separate storm sewer permits, those MS4 permits, as well as discharge permits for industrial facilities or that have specific outfalls. Next slide, please. And so those water quality standards, as I said, are developed at the state level. There are 3 elements to those water quality standards. There are the criteria that relate to the specific pollutants. There are the designated uses. Those designated uses are what we want those waters to be used for. And then there's anti-degradation policy. So the overall policy of the Clean Water Act is that none of the waters in the US should be getting any worse. So any kind of permitting, any kind of actions taken in our waterways, we should be ensuring that none of those waterways are degrading beyond the existing water quality. Next slide, please. And so the criteria piece are where we really get to where we're really going to see how we're going to be managing pollutants and trash as a pollutant. And there are 2 kinds of criteria. There are narrative criteria and numeric criteria. And as Colleen mentioned, I've been working with River Network over several years in the Delaware River Basin. So the examples I'm using are from the Delaware, but you're going to find similar things in your state water quality standards as well. So the narrative one here relates to nutrients. It just tells you, sort of provides the conditions that should be in that waterway with respect to pollutants. And then the numeric example is related to chlorides and just sets that numeric standard that you should be able to measure when you do water quality testing of 250 milligrams per liter. So you can have 2 kinds of water quality criteria. Next slide, please. And what we most often see for trash is that it is addressed in a narrative criteria. In fact, I don't know of any examples where trash is not addressed in a narrative criteria. And here are the 4 examples for the Delaware River Basin. So sometimes these are called the free froms, so the water should be free from substances that are attributable to industrial, municipal, other origins. New Jersey says, if you look through that language, it says there will be none, nothing noticeable, none in the waters. New York also says none in any event, in any amounts. Pennsylvania, interestingly, says that these substances will be controlled. So in any case, that's sort of the framing that we have with respect to trash and the narrative criteria that are often developed for states. You'll see something probably very similar in your states. As I said, I've been partnering with the River Network for a while in the Delaware River Basin, and know that there are a lot of organizations throughout the basin that have been doing river cleanups. I've worked with organizations in other parts of the country that have been doing river cleanups. And, just very recently had sort of this sort of aha, or should I say duh moment, like we're not reporting this information back to our state agencies in the context of this, really thinking about trash as a pollutant. These trash cleanups often happen as public outreach events and might be reported back in the context of an MS4 permit as one of those public outreach events, but we weren't reporting it back as data about pollutants. And I know, from some of the work that I've done in the past, there are water bodies that have trash TMDLs. I've worked in the mid-Atlantic long enough to, like the Anacostia has a trash TMDL, and just sort of felt silly that I hadn't made the connection that we need to start reporting this information as data about a pollutant in our watersheds in the Delaware. And so that was some of the impetus for having this session today. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Carla.
Hi, everyone. I am here to tell you a bit about our trash program here at River Network. It's pretty broad, so we're really taking kind of a national approach to litter removal and waterway restoration. You can go to the next slide. So, as I'm sure everyone knows, we obviously are facing a really large litter problem across the United States. In a report that was released in 2020 by Keep America Beautiful, they logged 26 billion pieces of litter near waterways in America. And 90% of US residents report that litter is a problem. So it's basically something that everyone is in agreement of, that we need to really figure out how to manage our litter. At River Network, we really take an approach with litter management in a few different ways, but it's mainly guided by corporate partnerships. So my role at River Network is really working with these 3 partners listed on the slide here: the Coca-Cola Foundation, Ball Corporation, and Anheuser-Busch, to identify ways that we can really tackle the litter problem and remove litter from the source. So I'm sure everyone's kind of aware of this, but this is a graphic that I really love. I think it does a really great job of showing how trash moves from its source location to our waterways or just our landscape. So you can see pretty clearly here all the different types of methods that litter escapes from where it's supposed to be, including just it falling on the ground, someone throwing it on the ground, getting blown out of a trash bin, to illegal dumping. So there's a variety of different sources of litter, which makes it quite complicated to really address and mitigate litter from the source. Next slide. So at River Network, we have a few different approaches. And the first and most traditional that I'm sure everyone's aware of are these people-powered interventions. So we will partner with corporate organizations to activate their employees as well as community volunteers to just do very traditional litter cleanups. So with Anheuser-Busch, we have partnered with them for the last 11 years, and we've removed over 1 million pounds of trash, which is super significant. And they also focus a lot on waterway restoration projects. So you'll see here it says 68,180 trees planted. That's another major focus for us. Of course, we want to remove the litter from our waterways, but we also need to address erosion and waterway restoration, because once you remove that trash, you really need to make sure that the waterway is in good shape, and that you're really helping it out and managing erosion and things like that. So that's kind of our impact with Anheuser-Busch, just with people-powered interventions. Next slide. And we continue to do this with other partners. So we have a very new partnership with Ball, just 2 years. And in those 2 years, we've removed almost 75,000 pounds of litter, which is pretty impressive considering that we had a year of COVID where no one was going outside and doing anything. So this is really just impacts from last year. So as I mentioned at the start, everyone knows that litter is a problem, and there's people out there who really, really want to help get rid of it. So these types of interventions, just traditional litter cleanups, restoration projects, it is a lot easier to find volunteers for those than I think we might expect. And we can make a really, really big, significant impact if we can get people outside to pick up litter. Next slide. So the new approach we're really taking with this are these infrastructure interventions. So in the last few years, we've started partnering with the Coca-Cola Foundation to kind of get down to the macro level. How can we capture litter without necessarily needing people to go out there? So it really kind of streamlines the work that needs to be done. So what we've started doing is installing these in-stream litter capture devices around the country. And this is making a really big impact in a variety of different waterways. It captures litter as it's flowing downstream, and it gets emptied out once a month or more, depending on storms. So this is a really kind of low touch way to manage litter, and one that we're really starting to explore a lot more. Next slide. So in our program with these in-stream litter capture devices, we partner with local nonprofits around the country to install different varieties of devices in their local waterways. And when we kind of start these conversations, we really start off with this litter toolkit. So this is a really fantastic resource if anyone is interested in checking it out. It's kind of a guide as to how to really approach litter management in your communities. So in here, there is a really fantastic chart that goes over the different types of devices that are on the market, what they might cost, what they could potentially capture. So this is a great resource if you're kind of thinking about in-stream litter capture devices, but really the purpose of this toolkit is to start from the beginning. So how do you do a litter assessment in your community? How do you identify hotspots? What are the different steps to really figuring out the best methods for approaching litter management in your communities? And maybe that's not installing a device. Maybe it is just doing cleanup. So every location is different, and this litter toolkit is kind of how we start every kind of assessment that we're doing in each area that we are working in. Next slide. So these in-stream litter capture devices, it is still a pretty new program, but we have made some significant strides. This map might be a little hard to see, but these blue points are places where we have funded devices that have gone in. And these yellow points are areas where we are planning to install devices. So we've installed already 4, and this year we're working on 3 more. And then we have other cities that we're kind of identifying as places that might want to install devices. So we're trying to support them in installing these devices. So we really rely on the local on-the-ground partnerships to get this work done. So honestly, the most important parts to accomplishing a successful approach with litter management really comes down to the community investment, local investment, and engagement. Of course, removing litter is extremely important. We want it to get out of our waterways, out of our landscapes, but it's not going to really succeed farther than that without community buy-in. So with all of our devices, we kind of help organize these really robust community engagement strategies. Here's an example in Village Creek in Birmingham, Alabama, where they've actually organized cleanups in areas nearby the devices so that they can kind of show people, hey, if we remove the trash from here, it won't even make it into the stream in the first place to go into the device, and that's a plus. And then you can move even farther back, like, hey, if we can stop this local business from dumping their trash, or maybe they need a trash can, then we don't even have to pick up the trash that's here in the first place. So being able to kind of create that bird's eye view, I think, is really key to the success of these kinds of programs. And getting the community involved with the maintenance of these devices or outreach for these devices really just helps build more local investment. Next slide. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but essentially this is just a great example of how community engagement and outreach really can help expand this program. So in Birmingham, Alabama, where you see this star, that is the first device that everyone in the water, that was a device that River Network funded. And now you can see there's 12 more devices that have popped up since then. And we only installed that device 2 years ago. So it has just really exploded, and it really comes down to the organizations that were working on that first device really developed a very, very strong community outreach strategy where they were reaching community members, local city council people, municipal waste districts to really get folks to understand how beneficial these devices are and how much litter can be removed just by having these devices in the water. So that's why local investment is key. There's also really interesting ways to approach the type of work that needs to be done in order to remove the trash from the devices, or kind of focus on that more tactical strategy. And that, for us, we're really trying to explore workforce development programs. So if we can partner with local organizations that have workforce development and utilize that resource for removing litter from these devices or helping remove litter in areas around the devices, not only does it create jobs and job training, but it also helps build more community support as well. And then we are supporting the community through this project. So it's a multifaceted approach to litter management, but it really, really comes down to the people, not just the devices and the trash. Next slide. And so that is a good indicator of behavior change really needing to be the overarching strategy to managing litter. So now, as we're kind of entering this third year of this program, we're starting to focus a lot on behavior change. So if we can use all of the data that we're getting from these devices, we can actually create a marketing campaign and do outreach and education to try to impact change from the source. So here, what you'll see on this slide is not something that we have done as an organization, but I think is a fantastic example of how data can translate to behavior change. So in San Francisco, a group of people used this app called Literati, where you actually log data points of trash you're picking up and take photos of it. And then you can use all of those data points for a variety of different uses. And this group actually used it to go to the government and say, hey, we've picked up a really significant amount of cigarette butts. And they were able to implement a cigarette tax just based off of the data from picking up trash. So with all of the trash that we remove from the in-stream litter capture devices, we are categorizing all of that by brand, by type of material, by size. And eventually we'll have enough data that we can really look at trends and look at sources and go to those and think about how can we actually change behaviors from consumers or producers and stop litter from even happening in the first place. So it's a really, really complicated thing to deal with. Litter is not black and white, and we are kind of approaching it from a variety of different angles. And this year moving forward, we'll really, really be kind of refocusing our efforts on the behavior change piece and trying to influence litter stopping from the source. I see in the chat someone mentioned the Clean Swell app. That is another fantastic app for picking up litter. We just use Literati because it's a little less focused on marine litter, but the Ocean Swell app can be used for any application. It does not just have to be marine litter. Next slide. So that is kind of how River Network approaches litter management on a national scale, really kind of focusing now on how we can use data to really create action when it comes to litter removal and mitigation. There's a variety of resources I have linked here that you can check out later. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I actually have to hop off to go to an appointment, so I will not be here later for questions and answers. But if you have any, feel free to ask Colleen or just email me afterwards, and I'm happy to try and answer your question. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Carla. And with that, we're going to turn to Christian to learn about their strategy in the Bronx River.
Thank you, and hi everyone. Thanks again for joining our session today. My name is Christian Murphy, pronouns he, him. I am the Ecology Coordinator for the Bronx River Alliance. We are a nonprofit located in the Bronx in New York City, and a big part of what I do is to organize students and volunteers, and basically all community members of any age, to collect data on the Bronx River and to engage in stewardship activities. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies that we've used to combat litter in the Bronx. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of context. The Bronx River is a 23-mile long river. It flows through 2 counties in New York, through Westchester County and through the Bronx. And it is New York City's only freshwater river. And so there's definitely a lot of attention that gets paid to this water body because of its unique status, the ecosystem that it supports, and the wildlife that we find here. It's also a river that has had a very interesting and complicated history. And so at one point in time, it was so clean that it was almost considered a source of drinking water for the city of New York. Very quickly that changed with the Industrial Revolution, and with the river being seen as a engine to power, the economy in the region. So there's a lot of legacy problems that the river experiences. These 2 images on the screen are the same location, maybe 70 years apart from each other. We transformed this park from an industrial landscape into a recreational space. And so bit by bit, we're trying to reclaim the landscape and return it to nature, but litter is one thing that is really, really persistent. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of what we deal with here in the Bronx. So this is a log jam. This is what happens when a tree comes down and is flowing downstream and gets stuck. Or if there's a really heavy storm, Hurricane Ida comes to mind as a source of a lot of lumber and woody debris in the Bronx River. Give it 2 weeks tops, and this is what happens. And so this is actually located inside the Bronx Zoo. So the Bronx River flows through the New York Botanical Gardens and through the zoo, and this is just really not something that anybody should have to look at on a river. Basically, the Bronx River is a source of trash for all of New York City's waters. A 2015 report determined that up to 165 million pieces of garbage are floating around New York City's harbor at any given time, and up to 80% of that might originate in the Bronx. So this is a major, major contribution to pollution throughout the city, just from this one water body. So a lot of effort is being paid to try to deal with this. But we also had a couple of assumptions and stereotypes to challenge that we're still overcoming now, and in the process are guiding some of the work that we're trying to do. So the most prevalent challenge is that, and it bases itself on stereotypes, that the river is really filthy because the Bronx as a borough is really filthy. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with the social landscape of New York City, the Bronx has some of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. Significant portion of the population live at or below the poverty line, and most of the communities in the Bronx are BIPOC. Just a couple miles upstream are some of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. And so this river really does kind of join these 2 parts of America together in a very short distance, which is really interesting and poses some interesting challenges. But we did not like this assumption. And so for years, this is what's been said, and it just, nobody likes to hear that, and it didn't sit well. But we didn't really have much to do about, challenging this assumption until 2016, when there was an oil spill on the river, and we received a settlement from the company. And it was, I think, about $6,000. And with that settlement, we were able to purchase a trash boom. And so, of course, the best place to put the trash boom was on the county border between the Bronx and Westchester. And so for 5 years now, we've been collecting data on all the trash that comes downstream from Westchester County that gets caught before it's able to enter into New York City proper. And so this has allowed us to start to look at not only what is in the river, but also how much. And so we've actually found that the majority of trash flowing downstream is not coming from the Bronx. It's coming from Westchester County. It's coming from these wealthier, more affluent communities upstream. And the DEP has another trash boom at the bottom of the Bronx River, near the mouth of the river in the South Bronx. And when our trash boom is removed, when it's not actually in place, the DEP reaches out to us to ask what's going on because they get an influx in materials down there. So we know that, this is bolstering our argument that we have to look upstream. We have to be looking at facilities and other entities north of the Bronx to try to figure out what's going on. Next slide. So what we developed in 2016 was a program called Project Waste. Waste is an acronym that stands for Waterway and Street Trash Elimination. And essentially, this is a trash monitoring protocol. It has turned out to be one of our most popular volunteer engagement programs. People ask for this program by name. I get lots of emails of folks wanting to come out and participate. There must be something about just putting on waders and standing in the river that no matter what you're doing, it's kind of fun. In this case, folks are catching and categorizing trash from the boom. And so we use a data sheet that has lots of little categories that we're able to tally every single thing that comes out of the boom as we're removing it. And so it is really impactful for the community, for students and folks young and old alike, to actually be collecting scientific data at the same time as they are cleaning the river physically. It really is a great way to engage the community, and we've engaged, at this point, I think closer to 4,000 folks, and we've removed well over 7 tons of trash in those years. And so with this data sheet, we're able to look at the number of cigarette butts, we're able to look at Dunkin' Donuts cups versus Starbucks cups, and other kinds of detritus that's flowing downstream. If you go to the next slide. I think, yeah, so this is just from last year. And this is just preliminary. Some of the data is still coming in, but this is a trend that we've seen basically every single year that this project has been in operation. Styrofoam dominates the trash that is coming out of our trash boom. We're not entirely sure why. This is something that was not predictable. Folks did not know, actually, what was going to be the dominant litter type. The assumption was that it would be either cigarette butts or like water bottles or soda bottles. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of those as well. But the really mysterious piece is the styrofoam. Styrofoam plates, styrofoam cups, compressed boards that you might find if you order like a flat screen TV. These things, they break down into lots of little itty bitty pieces, and that's really what's making up most of this slurry that we find at the trash boom. And so the interesting thing is that we've been able to refine some of our lines of inquiry regarding how to do outreach. And so initially, folks thought we'd have to talk to DOT and talk to some of these gas stations about like, hey, folks are buying a lot of coffee cups and throwing them out the window, or they're smoking a lot of cigarettes and throwing them out the window. And this is just not quite true. Yes, it is definitely a problem, but it looks like our biggest outreach is going to have to be to facilities upstream. And so we're in the process now of identifying wholesale distributors and waste management facilities that are lining the river from here up to 23 miles from here in White Plains, New York. And there are a lot of facilities up there. And so the amazing thing about this program is that it has been such a cool and amazing grab for volunteers that Westchester County has also adopted it. And so in addition to this trash boom that we have on the border, there are now 2 trash booms to the north, one in the town of Scarsdale and one in the town of Tuckahoe. And so we've been able to break the river up into 3 reaches. And so we know that anything coming downstream in our trash boom is only coming from within the 3 miles between here and the next boom up. And that's made that search much easier. It helped us to refine some of the differences between those trash booms. All of them are still dominated by styrofoam. And so the interesting thing is that styrofoam really enters the river from multiple point sources all along its length, which is interesting. And so we were able to advocate for the banning of styrofoam products both in New York City and Westchester County. But unfortunately, the timing was such that these bans kind of went into effect just before the pandemic hit, and then were immediately relaxed. And so to relieve the stress on business owners and other workers who use styrofoam because it's cheap and durable, these regulations were relaxed, and we're hoping that they are going to be enforced more strictly in the future. We have not seen a reduction in styrofoam from the legislation. So this is a good thing to note, that just because something goes into law does not mean that you're going to see an immediate impact. Folks always ask us like, oh, what happened during the pandemic? Did you see a reduction in trash at the trash room? Initially, yes, but then very quickly, no. When folks began to come out and they weren't employed and they weren't in school, they were using our parks along the river for recreation and just healing spaces. And that actually contributed a significant amount of trash to the river. Unfortunately, we were not able to get our staff out there, so we don't have the data from 2020. But we know that the data from 2021 looks just like the data from 2019. And so it's very easy to imagine that that middle year that we're missing was probably very similar. And we know anecdotally that folks were still seeing lots of garbage floating downstream. So I don't think the pandemic had a big impact. But we are happy that we have developed this program, not only as a way to encourage folks to come out to the river, to engage with us, and participate in our programming, but also to try to inspire change behaviorally. So folks leave a project waste collection event with this kind of shock and awe of having been surrounded by such a slurry of garbage. And that really motivates people to start talking to their family members, to start talking to their neighbors and their classmates, and be like, hey, don't buy that, use a reusable bag, use a reusable coffee cup. But you should see what I just saw with the Bronx River Alliance and the Bronx River. It will change your life. And this is kind of where we're hoping a lot of this change takes place, is on the ground with our folks. And then, of course, we're going to be doing our outreach to entities and elected officials in Westchester County to talk about how we're going to deal with the styrofoam issue. And I see in the chat a question of whether this is by weight or volume. It's actually just by number. So these are just individual pieces of styrofoam. I don't think they actually take up that much weight, truly. But if we count every individual piece, I mean, it's in the tens of thousands over the course of years. Whereas things like water bottles are just in like single thousands. So the actual quantity of the styrofoam is the mind-boggling aspect here. Yeah, next slide. The last slide. So our future, right, we're looking at trying to get Mr. Trash Wheel. So Mr. Trash Wheel, if you're not familiar, is an automated trash collecting device. I think he is solar powered. I think he is renewable. He sits here and he eats trash all day. And so this, I think, would really expand our capacity at the Bronx River Alliance to be collecting trash in multiple locations at once. And we want this trash wheel at the bottom of the river, excuse me, the bottom of the watershed, not at the bottom of the river, but at the bottom of the watershed near the mouth of the river where the city owns its own trash boom. Unfortunately, New York City does not quantify the material that it removes from that trash boom. They just look at volumetric analysis. And so if there's a storm that breaks up a lot of trees, they don't count, they don't look at whether or not it's woody debris versus pieces of plastic or styrofoam. So we are losing a bit of information down there, whereas a trash wheel that has a camera over the conveyor belt would really help us out, as well as be, a talking piece and a learning tool that we could use for the community. So we're in the process of looking at this. We did a feasibility study, and it looks like Mr. Trash Wheel would be just, would be right at home in the Bronx River. So this might be what the future of the Bronx River looks like. In the meantime, we will continue to engage volunteers and students in project waste, and we will continue to tailor outreach to our entities in hopes that one day we'll get everybody on the same side to try to stop the flow of trash into the Bronx and into New York City in general.
Great, thank you very much, Christian. We do have a bunch of questions in the chat. Maybe you could try answering some of them in the chat, because we're going to move right on to Rosanna. And if we haven't gotten a chance to get to those, we'll come back to them at the end. So now we're going to turn to the Hudson.
Awesome. Thanks, Ellen, and thanks, Christian, for that beautiful overview of the Bronx River. And I love that I get to go right after the trash wheel. I am a strong advocate, want to see the trash wheel in the Bronx as well as in other areas here in the estuary. So hi, everyone. My name is Rosanna Da Silva. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Water Quality Program Manager for the Hudson River Foundation and the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program, commonly referred to as HAP. We are one of the nation's 28 estuaries of national significance, and our program helps bring together diverse stakeholders, including scientists, citizens, and policymakers to work towards the goal of fishable and swimmable waters for the people and wildlife called for by the Clean Water Act. Next slide. And so I want to take a moment and just acknowledge the Munsee Lenape lands that I reside on, and also recognize the complex history and the many indigenous peoples of the past and currently residing in the Harbor Estuary region. As you can see here on the map, the Harbor Estuary is the biggest public resource in the nation's largest and most densely developed metropolitan area. Our estuary scope extends to the watersheds of the Hudson and Raritan. So we have a northern boundary They're at Troy Dam near Albany, New York, and we go all the way down to the southern boundary of the Sandy Hook Rockaway Point transect. Next slide. And has Christian, as well as the other earlier presenters demonstrated, right, trash continues to be a persistent water quality issue, particularly here in our estuary. And it is a very visible water quality contaminant, right? It's like the first thing that people can see. It creates the impression and continues to support that notion that our waterways are dirty. So hard to say, right? Like if we're trying to talk about the Clean Water Act and trying to achieve fishable, swimmable, and the first thing people think of is trash in our waters, very hard to have those conversations of how do we, get to fishable, swimmable. And so overcoming that perception and creating that connection to the waterways where shoreline cleanups are so important. And I think Carla, as well as Christian's presentation, they both mentioned how the success and the importance of local community buy-in and how cleanups really create that engagement and stewardship opportunities that would help support that behavior change. And while the cleanups are important for both stewardship and the removal of the debris, it's also a band-aid to the overall issue, which is how do we keep trash out of our waterways? And the answer is really a multi-pronged approach, right? It's community buy-in, it's physical infrastructure that you need to put, whether it's a boom or Mr. Trash Wheel, it's policy and management decisions, right? And so what we had started to do to try to better inform managers in the estuary was create this initiative called Stopping Trash Where It Starts, in partnership with Montclair State University and a number of community groups, including the Bronx River Alliance. And we began this project in 2017 with initial funding from NUEPIC and later with EPA to collect data on the types, sources, and conditions that can lead to marine debris. And we developed this protocol specifically for right-of-way debris assessment and applied it to 4 watersheds, the Passaic, the Hackensack, the Harlem, and the Bronx River. And this was really important because it started to look outside of the shoreline, right? And trying to make those connections from what you're seeing on the river, on the shoreline to local neighborhoods, right? To see what is that interaction between the people who live and work near these waterways, what are their contributions to the debris we're seeing in the waterway and along the shoreline. And so we did create this protocol for the right-of-way, and everything is available on this link that I'll share in the chat later. But basically the protocol really asks all the community groups that were involved to look at trash that's collected from the end of the property line to the end of the sidewalk or curb, and then 1 foot into the street or equivalent to the end of a catch basin. To really just collect that data in that space, right? To understand, what is the type of debris and materials that we're seeing. We did not include crosswalks. We had a buffer zone from the site location to the nearby water body. We avoided street cleaning, trash pickup, and recycling days. And we not only just tallied the types and materials, but we also calculated the volume as well as the weight. And also we incorporated site descriptions that, included, counting the number of trash bins you would see in this, specific segment that we identified. We counted the number of catch basins that we would see. We counted, how many people we saw walking while we were out there collecting data and how many cars passed by, right? To kind of understand what's that correlation between the debris that we're seeing on the ground versus our own behavior in these areas. So next slide. And so ultimately, really, this project worked to fill in a data gap that we had, right, in looking at the right-of-way for more direct pollution prevention measures that can be targeted by a material or by municipalities or district or by key stakeholders, right? And I think I've had this conversation with Christian and folks at the Bronx River Alliance of how surprised we were to see that when we did the right-of-way assessments, we didn't see significant amount of styrofoam in the streets, but we are seeing significant styrofoam in the river. And so this now really does provide that opportunity to have a conversation of like, okay, it's not the local neighborhood that is bringing in the styrofoam, it's certainly coming upstream, and it helps us narrow down where those issues are and where we need to identify the point source to start having those conversations to address that issue there. And it really ultimately allows, and I'm still diving into the data set itself because it's so rich, and it really lets us to begin looking at land use and human behavior. And one of the other things that I found really interesting in the Passaic watershed, for example, was they noticed the community groups decided to select kind of different areas along the Passaic River, so a residential area versus a business corridor. And what they found really interesting was that in the business corridor, there was this uptake of tobacco products found. And this was obviously pre-pandemic, and so it was, we just sat there. And we're like, oh, it's a business corridor, it's a business district. People are probably stepping out of their business and having a cigarette break. And instead of having a place where they are able to dispose of their cigarettes properly, they're just flicking it down on the street, right? And so having that community group being able to now have that data to engage the business district, to even just recommend like, hey, can you at least put like a pot full of sand to help smokers dispose of their cigarettes, properly. So these are kind of the conversations that we're hoping to engage further with the data sets that we have. And, I think, not surprisingly to Carla's point, which was, there is a lot of drink and food related single-use plastics across each of the watersheds evaluated when we're looking at the right of way. And so to me, that clearly identifies that it is a human behavior problem. It is a, producer and consumer issue. And, the question then becomes like, how do we address that from there? Go to the next slide. And so while, my organization, we can't necessarily advocate, we can use the good science to support management and policy decisions. So we look at, how can we provide funding to local groups that are really, passionate and actively trying to address the trash problems in the waterways at a very local level. But then also, how can we provide that data, to be powerful in those conversations. And so we ended up partnering with Plastic Free Waters to begin a pledge, and we provided some small grants to local partners to, be able to engage residents and community groups to have a discussion around trash and have a discussion with council members and mayors about the policies that the community would support, right? So the pledge is basically asking someone like, okay, what would you be comfortable with reducing your use of, like, between all these single-use plastics, straws, bags, cups, mugs, balloons even, right? So it enables to have that, at least the data for people to start having a conversation of passing those policies. But of course, as Christian mentioned, right, COVID definitely put a pause on a lot of these policies that were, years in the making and pushing, right? And so how do we, come back from the pandemic and continue to have those conversations to enforce those policies that were put in place? And so really, there's still so much work to do. I think we need to all, still use our data, encourage everyone to use data to really tell the story of what you're seeing. And I think we do have to sit back and think of, like, how many other organizations are doing these types of cleanups, and, how can we engage them in similar protocols so that way we can combine our data and have really a rich data set that would have power in conversations to really make those policy and management changes that are necessary and needed to achieve, what we're all here trying to achieve, which is trash-free waters. So I want to just leave it with, I encourage you all to kind of think about, about your cleanups. How are you collecting data? How are you engaging with others who are collecting the data? How are you then using your data, right? And how are you creating those conversations so that way we can strengthen not just, our own programs, but, all of the community scientists that are engaged in this conversation and wanting to see the reduction of trash in our waterways. So thank you for your time. I think I'm passing it on to Martha.
Yep. Great, thanks.
Hi, this is Martha Narvaez from the University of Delaware Water Resources Center. We're one of 54 water resource institutes in the nation. And I am here, I'm gonna try and do this really quickly because we have like 9 minutes left. And a lot of the things that I was gonna mention have already been mentioned, but so you can go to the next slide. All I'm gonna say here is that Ellen opened up talking about the Clean Water Act, and, we're at the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. And, we have been able to, put regulations in place to keep chemical and physical pollutants out of the waterways, yet we see enormous amounts of trash. They have a huge impact. Plastic, cigarette butts, we're, continually seeing that these are some of the top contributors to our trash problem. And as all of you have said, trash should be used as a tool. I think it's something that the community can see. It's something that the community can actually pick up and actually have sort of not only a visual, but an action associated with it. We talk a lot at the Water Resources Center about nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment and bacteria, and people don't know what to do with that. And I think that trash is a really good public education tool, and not only just to physically get people out there removing trash, but also in an entry into other topics related to water resources and reducing pollution. So next slide. We talked a lot about TMDLs and the importance of TMDLs and trash TMDLs. And we gathered as a group with some water resource folks that wanted to talk about the trash topic. Ellen gathered us together. And so my graduate students who deserve, most of the credit for this report and information pulled together information on what we're doing in Delaware and sort of the status of trash TMDLs. And as Ellen mentioned, there's a trash TMDL in the Anacostia. That was a second TMDL. The first trash TMDL was in the Los Angeles area. The Anacostia River is unique because it spans two states, DC and Maryland. So there are trash TMDLs out there. We do not have a trash TMDL in Delaware. And we're looking into it. I think there's pros and cons to TMDLs. And as it relates to trash. So what we're doing, you can go to the next slide. What we're doing in Delaware is, as Rosanna said, we're looking at the data and we're trying to use the data that we find to tell a story. And so the first piece of that for us in Delaware is, what data do we have? What cleanups are happening? Where are they happening? I've gotten a lot of really good information from this webinar from everyone here, because we're at the very beginning of this process. And, what I'm finding and what our students are finding is there's not a whole lot of data available or in one space. So what we did was we looked into where are the cleanups happening in Delaware and pulling that into a database. And, we came up with about 10. I know there's a lot missing. So how do we get that information and how do we make it publicly available, but also make it available to the state, to our regulators to know that these activities are occurring and that they are having an impact on pollution reduction. So you can go to the next slide. We're also looking at data collection tools. So a lot of you have mentioned different tools, apps like Literati and other apps that you can use for the public to use when cleanups are set up. What are the drawbacks? What are the pros and cons to some of them? Which ones are the best ones to use? How are people using social media when it comes to recording trash and showing, cleanups and inviting people to cleanups? And also, how do we record the actual trash that's being collected, the type of trash, where it's being collected, how many volunteers are there, and the amounts. Next slide. So just to kind of get an idea of what's out there, myself and two of the grad students, Haley and Liz, who are both on this call, Haley Roast and Liz Shields, went out and just kind of looked around. Wilmington is the largest city in Delaware. Obviously not very big to a lot of you coming from New York and New Jersey, but it's the biggest city we have, and it's a very urbanized area. So we went to, the city is sort of divided by the Christina River and the Brandywine, and they then drain to the Delaware. So we went out and looked at one site on the Christina River, which is a highly trafficked area. It's the top picture. And obviously there was lots of trash there. There was a dock there that had bags of trash hanging. We went to our second site, which was right at the confluence of the Brandywine and the Christina, sort of behind an industrial park. And again, lots of trash. This one was more prone to dumping. And then the third site was the Brandywine Creek, which is in a park, which is managed by state parks. There was much less trash. And it was clear that that area was more maintained. So it just kind of showed us the variety of areas just within the city. You can go to the next slide. You can go, okay. So where we are now, we are still collecting data. We want to refine the inventory of cleanups that we pulled together and really start talking to our networks and figuring out what's missing and make an inventory available to the public as well as the state. We want to figure out the best way to inventory the types of litter and amounts of litter. So I've gotten a lot of great ideas from this call. We want to look at where the cleanups are happening. Are most of them happening in northern Delaware? Do we need more in Kent and Sussex? Where do we need them? Where are the areas that are highly impacted by trash? We want to figure out the best technologies to use. And we also want to collaborate with DNREC and look at both voluntary and regulatory approaches to see what's going on and to see what might be the best approach in Delaware to reduce trash. So that's all I have. Hopefully I got through that quick enough.
Thank you very much, Martha. I will say that if we have 2 minutes left, if folks need to hop off, go right ahead. But I have seen multiple questions around trying to get folks motivated to actually tally their trash data. So I don't know if either Christian or Rosanna wants to comment on getting them to actually do the data sheets.
I could start by saying that it's us staff members who do the tallying and not our volunteers. They'll actually call out. We try to get them to say, okay, wait until you've picked up like a nice round number, like 10 of something, like 10 water bottles or 10 soda bottles, and then say that. So it's easier for us, but it's been impossible to get them to do any of the tallying. So we've been doing that. So if the apps make that easier, happy to hear all of those recommendations.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Christian. It definitely is difficult for volunteers. You can certainly, try, and we've taken some of the. I've worked with a teacher trying to, how do you separate the tally sheet and create teams of students, right, that can go out and tally it. But it does get a little complicated. We did take some time, kind of from like our lessons learned from the Passaic, from all of these different rivers that we engage with on the tally sheet of like, okay, let's scale this back in terms of like what's really important on the protocol. That if you really bootstrap, don't really have a lot of funding or a lot of manpower, what pieces of that protocol is super critical that you should at a minimum do versus if you had more funding or more volunteers, more hands on deck, right? How you can upgrade your protocol to really encompass the full scope that we were trying to capture, right? So it continues to be a challenge. And I think, at the end of the day, it's, how are you going to use your data? And so if it's really important that it's at a high quality, right, then, having staff doing the tally forms is probably best, just to have some kind of, security of that you're meeting your protocols that you put in place.
I think that's a really, really good point. Like, think about why you're collecting the data, and so what level of refinement you really need. There have also been some great comments in the chat about designating somebody to be the sort of the data record keeper and setting things up, knowing that part's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So really appreciate that. I think we could probably stay on and have another, half an hour at least conversation of trash talk. I feel like we should start a monthly trash talk call just so I can say that a gazillion times because I love saying it. Anyway, I cannot thank you guys enough, Christian, Rosanna, and Martha, and Carla, who had to drop off, for sharing all this. I think we probably would love to I'd love to have a follow-up conversation about, with some how-tos and questions that people now have, because it is definitely cleanup season. I got my first email about my first cleanup already. We are in cleanup season. And so the more that we can think about how to use these cleanups to even get further with our water quality goals, I think, we all benefit from that. And certainly our waterways do too. So thank you guys all very much. Look for more, and we look forward to engaging with you all about trash.
Thank you for hosting.
Glad to be here. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.